What is extraordinary about caring for someone in the final stretch of life is that everything suddenly becomes more meaningful than ever before. Every word, every touch, every meal. At that point, it is no longer about nutrition or survival. It is about making someone feel loved, remembered, and still themselves, even as they slowly slip away from this world. My name is Emma Brooks, 28 years old, a personal chef who serves people in end-of-life care. I know it sounds unusual who chooses to cook for someone who is dying, but I chose it because in those fragile, brutal days, I see people most clearly. The meals I prepare do more than nourish the body, they comfort, they awaken memories. They bring people back to a place in their minds where they once felt safe. I have no office and no restaurant of my own. I have a simple website and a few honest words of introduction. A chef for the final moments, food is love. Those words have taken me into many homes, many families, and many griefs, but none of them were anything like the Romano household. Everything began on a Monday morning while I was making coffee in my small apartment in Montclair, New Jersey. My phone chimed softly, and I received an email with the subject Urgent Private Chef for Dying Mother. The message contained only a few lines: Need a personal chef for my mother, home hospice, terminal cancer. Only a few weeks left. She loves Italian food, especially traditional dishes. Cost is not an issue. Can you help? There was no name beyond a single initial M and an email address. I had learned not to ask too many questions at the beginning. Families who reach out to me are often desperate, grieving, trying to hold on to anything that brings a sense of normalcy or warmth. So I simply replied, I can help. When do I start? A response came immediately with a specific address. A house in Upper Montclair, where tall old trees cast shade over vintage European-style estates, where every window had silk curtains and every white picket fence was trimmed to perfection. That house carried the feeling of age, elegance, and secrets. I had cooked for wealthy families before, but something about this address felt different. Not because of the affluence, but because of something deeper, as if the place held a story waiting to be told, and somehow I had been invited inside. I gathered my tools, knives, cutting board, recipe notebook, and the hand-sewn apron my mother left me. That was all I needed for a new journey. I did not know I was about to step into a home that held not only a dying woman, but a past layered with loss, a family divided by grief, and a man trying to hold on to whatever remained in any way he could. And somehow, I would become the last person to make his mother smile. If you have listened this far and felt your heart fall still for a brief moment, then perhaps you are like me. Someone who believes that at times, a simple meal can heal something no words can ever reach. If this story has reminded you of someone or has simply warmed you from within, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with anyone who might be in need of a touch of gentleness in the rush of everyday life. Let me know where you are listening from by leaving a comment below. I would truly love to know which small corner of the world this story has found its way to. Together, let us create a community where memories, affection, and the echoes of love remain whole within every story we tell. That afternoon, I arrived at the Romano house with a bag filled with fresh ingredients, a handwritten recipe notebook, and a curiosity so quiet it did not yet have a name. The house sat at the end of a tree-shaded street, separated from the neighboring homes by a black iron fence and a tall, sturdy gate equipped with a security bell. I pressed the button, feeling a soft flutter in my chest, and after a long silence, the gate slowly opened. The stone path led to a classic villa with a red-tiled roof draped in lush green ivy. The door opened and I was welcomed by an older woman whose gentle face was softened by exhaustion, the kind born from many sleepless nights. She wore a cream-colored coat, her hair neatly tied at the back of her neck. "You are Emma, correct?" I nodded with a faint smile. "I am Maria, the caregiver for Miss Evelyn. She is in the sunroom today, is one of her better days. She may be able to eat a little." I followed Maria through a wide carpeted hallway lined with old photographs, mostly black and white portraits, of men in suits, women with bold vintage smiles, and children held in the arms of relatives during family gatherings. The house carried the breath of the past, a thick atmosphere of memory. The sunroom rested at the end of the hall, filled with soft afternoon light streaming through tall windows that stretched to the ceiling, with vases of colorful flowers scattered along wooden ledges. And in the center of that room stood a white hospital bed draped with a light pale blue blanket. On the bed, Evelyn Romano lay on her side, her silver hair gently tousled on the pillow, her skin thin as paper, yet her eyes, when they met mine, were bright, deep, and startlingly alive. "You are the chef," she said in a soft voice, tinged with an Italian lilt, like an old song heard many times before. "I am Emma. It is an honor to cook for you." "Just call me Evelyn," she replied with a faint smile. "Calling me anything else makes me feel older than I imagine myself to be." I smiled with her as I stepped closer, a strange sense of familiarity rising beneath my ribs. I asked what she wanted to eat today. Evelyn tilted her head as if winding backward through time. "Stuffed shells," she said after a few seconds. "My mother made them every Sunday, pasta shells filled with ricotta cheese baked in tomato garlic sauce, but the sauce must be cooked slowly for at least 3 hours, and must have fresh basil, not the dried kind. If the cheese is not soft enough, it will not melt the right way." The way she described the dish told me not only her preferences, but the longing tied to each detail. I reached for my notebook, but Evelyn shook her head. "Do not write. You seem like someone who knows how to listen. Listen closely. I do not need the dish to taste exactly the same. I need it to feel like when I was a girl in that cramped kitchen in Brooklyn where my mother cooked while singing opera. If you can bring even a hint of that scent back, that will be enough." I nodded slowly, holding my emotions steady. I had cooked for many people at the end of their lives, but something in Evelyn's gaze, a hunger for life, not for herself, but for memory, made me feel small. As I prepared to leave the room for the kitchen, a deep male voice sounded from the doorway. "So the chef is here." I turned. The man standing there was tall and solid, somewhere in his mid-30s, with dark hair and tired eyes shadowed by faint circles. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal tattoos curling from his wrist into the fabric. I recognized him as the one who had sent the email. "I am Michael," he said as he stepped in her son. "I am glad to meet you," I replied, extending my hand. He shook it firmly, his gaze lingering on me longer than most, as if trying to read something in my eyes without asking. "My mother does not eat much anymore," Michael said, his eyes drifting toward the bed. "But if you can make her feel comfortable, then—" His voice broke before he finished. "I will do my best," I said softly, then turned to Evelyn. "I will start on the stuffed shells right away. Even if you can only take one bite, and even if not, at least the house will smell the way your mother's kitchen did long ago." Evelyn closed her eyes, her lips lifting into the faintest smile. "As long as the smell is right," she whispered, "that alone will let me dream again." And I left the room, stepping into the kitchen where this story truly began. I did not know I was about to cook the final meals of a stranger. I knew even less that I was stepping into the quiet unraveling of a fractured family. But at that moment, all I had were stuffed shells, a little time, and the belief that sometimes a memory can be awakened by nothing more than the scent of garlic and melting cheese. The Romano family's kitchen was a warm, deeply Italian space with pale gray granite countertops, walnut cabinets darkened by the passing years, and a large window that opened toward the herb garden in the back, where the late afternoon light fell at an angle as if sprinkling gold across the sink. I paused for a moment as I stepped inside, drawing in the scent of the home, the fragrance of old wood, slightly damp curtains, and the faint aroma of dried lavender hanging by the window. There was something profoundly real and alive about it, as though this kitchen had once been the heart of the house and was now simply waiting for a reason to beat again. I set down my bag of ingredients and took out the large pasta shells, the fresh ricotta I had carefully chosen that morning from a shop owned by an Italian friend, a few sprigs of basil garlic shallots, and a jar of homemade tomato sauce I always carried with me, like a part of myself. When I poured olive oil into the pan and heard the familiar crackle, I felt my own tensions soften, as if the earlier nervousness dissolved with each tiny burst of oil. I chopped the shallots, minced the garlic, and began cooking the sauce, adding each ingredient slowly, feeling every aroma bloom into the air. 3 hours would have been ideal for simmering, but on a day like this, I knew I had to shorten the time without shortening the sincerity. While the sauce settled, I mixed the filling of ricotta, shredded mozzarella, a touch of parmesan, and finely chopped basil. Each movement stirred memories of my mother, who taught me that cooking was never a showy art, but a quiet act of love. I spread the first layer of sauce in the baking dish, gently filled each pasta shell as if tending to the memories Evelyn had entrusted to me, arranged them carefully, then covered them with more sauce, sprinkled a layer of mozzarella, and slid the dish into the oven. By the time I closed the oven door, the fragrance had begun to flow through the kitchen, drifting into the hallway, and perhaps already reaching the sunroom where Evelyn lay. I could not be certain she would smell it all, but I hoped. 45 minutes later, I removed the dish, steam rising fragrant and rich. The cheese melted into a golden blanket, the sauce a deep red like the color of memory. I plated a small portion on a white porcelain dish, added a few fresh basil leaves, and carried it to Evelyn's room. When I entered, she was resting with her eyes closed, her lips curved gently, as if she were dreaming something tender. I approached and called to her softly. Her eyes opened and moved from me to the plate in my hands, as if she were witnessing something she never expected to see again. "You work quickly," she murmured, her voice frail but relieved. "I made it with my whole heart," I replied, setting the plate on a small tray and gently helping her sit up. Maria assisted me with the pillows. Evelyn looked at the stuffed shells as though it were a piece of precious jewelry. Her hand trembled as she lifted the fork, took a tiny bite, and brought it to her lips. I saw her mouth quiver. Her eyes closed and a long, deep exhale slipped out of her like someone who had just found something she thought was lost forever. She said nothing for a long while. Then she opened her eyes and looked at me. "It tastes exactly as I remember. Not perfect in the way of a recipe, but perfect in the way of memory." I saw her eyes glisten, and mine did too. She took one more small bite, then leaned back against the pillows as though she had traveled a long distance. "This scent," she whispered. "This is the scent of Sunday." I glanced toward the doorway and saw Michael standing there silent as a shadow. He did not step inside, but his eyes were fixed on his mother, and in them I saw something I had not seen before, perhaps gratitude, or perhaps a hint of hope after too many weary months. I quietly stepped out, leaving Evelyn with her food, her memories, and the son who was trying to hold on to the last small pieces of the mother he was about to lose. I knew I was only at the beginning, but today, with nothing more than a dish of stuffed shells, I had helped a dying woman remember her childhood and allowed a grown man to feel, even for a moment, that his mother was still there. And to me, that was as beautiful a beginning as any story could ever ask for. The next morning I returned to the Romano house while the world was still wrapped in mist. The early air carried the faint chill of a New Jersey autumn, the leaves beginning to change color and falling sparsely along the stone walkway. I knocked on the door and Maria opened it with a tired smile that seemed gentler than the day before. "She slept well last night," Maria whispered. "After you left, she kept talking about the fragrance in the kitchen." I only nodded softly as I stepped inside, my heart warming in a way I could not quite name. The kitchen still held a trace of browned cheese and sweet tomatoes. I straightened the counters, cleaned the pots and pans, then began preparing an early lunch of light minestrone soup for someone whose strength was fading. As I was slicing carrots, a faint voice drifted from the end of the hallway. "Emma." I recognized Evelyn's voice instantly. I dried my hands and hurried to her room. She was sitting up in bed, her head tilted toward the window where sunlight slipped through the sheer white curtain. I sat down quietly in the chair beside her, waiting for her to speak. Evelyn looked at me for a long moment before offering a small, fragile smile. Do you know that yesterday was the first time in nearly 6 months I felt like a person again? I did not know how to answer, so I simply held her hand gently. Your food awakened something in me I thought had died long ago. It made me remember the early years after I married when my husband and I lived in a tiny apartment in Little Italy. Every weekend I made stuffed shells for him, and he always said it was the dish that made him feel as if his mother were holding him again. She paused, her voice catching in her throat. I said nothing. I had learned that silence is sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone who is remembering. Do you know, she continued, we once had a tradition every Sunday the whole family would come home for dinner. A long table. Children, grandchildren, neighbors, anyone who arrived had a place. But since I became sick, everyone slowly pulled away. They do not know what to say. They do not know how to face me. Only Michael, my only child, who stayed, and even he no longer knows how to speak to his own mother. I pressed her hand a little tighter, feeling the loneliness woven into her voice. I think I said softly, people do not avoid illness because they fear the disease. They avoid it because they fear the memories. They don't know what to hold on to, what to let go of. But you are still here. You still have days left to taste something familiar, to tell your stories. And if you want, I will be the one who listens. Evelyn turned her head toward me. Her eyes were no longer sharp, but in that moment, I felt a tender glimmer inside them. You are young. Why choose this kind of work? Why live among people who are dying? I had been asked this many times, but something about her question made me pause longer before replying. Because I grew up in a family where no one said how they felt. Everything was placed on the dinner table instead. When my mother died, I realized the only thing I remembered clearly was her food. Not her voice, not her face, but the smell of winter stew, the warmth of fresh bread split open from the oven. I want other people to keep their memories too, even if only through a meal. Evelyn nodded softly, tears shimmering at the corners of her eyes. You are the first person who understands, without my having to explain. I stayed beside her for a while longer, saying nothing, letting the quiet understanding drift through the sunlit room. She closed her eyes but kept her hand wrapped around mine. That was the moment I realized I had not come here only to cook. I had come to witness, to listen, and in some quiet way, to walk with Evelyn through her final days, not with fear, but with memory, with fragrance, and with the gentle presence of a stranger willing to stay. That evening, as I cleaned the kitchen and prepared to leave, Michael was standing on the front porch with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the empty yard, where a tall maple tree had begun shedding its brilliant red leaves like fragments of memory falling with the season. He did not speak when I stepped outside, only offered a quiet nod. I had not planned to stay yet. Something held my footsteps in place. Evelyn seemed better today, I said softly, careful not to disturb the stillness around us. Michael nodded slowly, then looked at me for a while, as if deciding whether to speak. At last he exhaled, his voice low and weighed down by exhaustion. I did not think she would eat anything again after last week, but yesterday, when I walked in and saw her eating the pasta like a child finding her mother again, I do not know how to thank you. I shook my head gently. You do not need to thank me. She just needed something familiar. Everyone has a flavor that makes them feel safe. Michael remained silent for a moment, then turned toward me with eyes that seemed softer than before. My mother used to be a strong woman. She grew up in a poor immigrant family, learned to cook when she was still a child, and raised 3 children while my father worked out of state. She kept everything inside, but her table was always full. I think that was the way she loved without speaking. As I listened to him, I heard in his voice a quiet sorrow no one had ever taught him how to release. He paused, his hand tightening into a fist, as if squeezing the memories into words. Do you know, he continued, she once hated me because I married someone she did not approve of. Emily was outside the community, not Italian, an art teacher. My mother said she did not understand the culture, that she could not keep the warmth of a traditional family. But then when Emily was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 33, it was my mother who cared for her during the last 2 years. I turned toward him, startled by what I had just heard. Michael let out a faint, sorrowful smile, the kind that looked as though it had been folded away for years. Emily died 5 years ago. After that, my mother changed. She did not say much, but I know she carried guilt. Maybe because she did not love Emily in the way Emily deserved. Or maybe because she learned to love too late, and now she is trying not to repeat that with me. I said nothing, just stood beside him, listening as though I were tending a silence that needed guarding. Michael looked at me again, his eyes dark and deep like the night sea. Do you have family? I nodded softly. I have an older brother in Oregon. My parents are gone. He nodded, then fell quiet, as though every small detail carried weight. A light breeze drifted past us, carrying the scent of herbs from the garden. Michael spoke again slowly. I am not good at expressing myself. I never have been. But when I saw my mother talk to you today, smile, even eat, I realized that your presence here is healing more than I expected. I lowered my head, feeling a small ache bloom in my chest at his words. I am only doing what I believe is right. Every meal I cook, I think about the person I lost. And I believe that if someone had been with my mother the way I am here with Evelyn, perhaps I would not have felt so helpless back then. Michael did not answer. He simply looked at me for a long moment, as though weighing something he found difficult to say. Then he spoke almost in a whisper. Thank you, Emma, for coming, for staying. I nodded and quietly stepped back inside. But in that moment, something in Michael's gaze had shifted. It was no longer the guarded look of someone protecting what he loves. It was the look of a man beginning to believe that sometimes goodness still finds its way in late. Perhaps, but just in time to save what remains. The next morning, when I stepped into the Romano house, I caught the faint scent of lavender drifting through the air, as if someone had just replaced a fresh bundle by the windowsill. Maria greeted me with a friendlier nod than usual, and Michael was nowhere to be seen, perhaps already out dealing with his own errands. I set my bag of ingredients on the kitchen counter and had not even begun unpacking when Maria approached and said softly, Miss Evelyn wants to see you. She says today is a special day. I dried my hands and made my way toward the sunroom, my heart stirring with curiosity. Evelyn was propped up against a pile of pillows covered with a pale blue hand-woven blanket. Her face still pale, but her eyes brighter than they had been in days. When she saw me, she smiled, her voice rough but filled with an unexpected resolve. Could you help me get to the kitchen today? I froze for a moment, taken aback, and before I could respond, she continued. I know I do not have much strength left, but there is a dish I have never taught anyone except my mother. I think it is time to pass it on to someone who knows how to listen. It took us nearly 20 minutes to move Evelyn into her wheelchair and guide her carefully into the kitchen. Maria positioned a high wooden chair with a backrest and draped a thick towel around her shoulders. I stood beside her waiting. Evelyn pointed toward the cabinet in the far left corner. Inside is a red tin box. Open it. I did as she asked, and inside were worn slips of paper aged to a warm yellow. The handwriting in dark ink still strong, some lines rewritten over and over again. This is orange rosemary roast chicken, but not the kind people make during the holidays. It is my great-grandmother's recipe from Calabria. Every woman in the family has passed it down, but no two versions were ever quite the same. I want you to learn mine. I unfolded the paper and skimmed the notes. It listed not only ingredients, but little messages scribbled along the margins. Do not use American oranges. Choose the small ones with the gentle tartness. Tuck the rosemary under the skin, not on top. And if the sauce does not turn caramel colored after 30 minutes, the heat is wrong. Evelyn began guiding me through each step, as if she were awakening a part of herself, untouched by illness. I prepared the chicken exactly as instructed, seasoning it with salt, pepper, honey, and fresh orange juice, setting it aside to rest before making the sauce with white wine, garlic, onions, and the remaining citrus. Evelyn watched closely, nodding occasionally, or reminding me of small details like, "Do not stir too soon. Let the onions touch the bottom of the pan a little longer." Every word she spoke felt like a pebble dropped into the lake of memory, sending ripples through my chest. When I placed the chicken stuffed with rosemary and curls of orange peel into the oven, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her eyes closed, still wearing that soft smile. "Do you know why I chose this dish?" I shook my head and sat beside her. "Because this is what I cooked on my wedding day. When my husband brought me out of Brooklyn to a small town by the sea, I did not know how to make him feel at home. Until I made this. He told me, 'You do not need to be my mother, you are yourself. But this taste, it is what makes me want to come home every night.'" I held the recipe paper a little tighter, feeling a sudden swell of emotion press against my ribs. Evelyn opened her eyes and looked at me, her voice quieter but steady. "I do not need you to cook it exactly as I do. I only need you to understand why I cook it that way." I nodded without speaking, placing my hand gently over hers. In that small kitchen with the oven ticking softly and the scent of orange and rosemary beginning to drift through the room, I realized I had been given something far more precious than a recipe. I had been trusted, chosen, handed a piece of the soul of a woman who had loved deeply, lost deeply, and now was preparing to leave it all behind. And I, with my hands and my heart, would keep that dish as a promise left unspoken. In the days that followed, the Romano kitchen became the place where Evelyn spent most of the little time she had left. She could no longer sit for long in her wheelchair, her legs weakening, her breath thinning, until it felt as fragile as a strand of thread. Each morning, Maria and I had to guide her from her room to the kitchen, settling her into a cushioned chair with a worn footstool propped beneath her feet. But one morning, just as I set a pan on the stove, Maria hurried in with a quiet sorrow in her eyes and spoke in a whisper as if afraid someone else might hear. "Emma, she did not sleep last night. Her pulse slowed a great deal. The doctor said, 'There may be only 1 week left.'" I set the spoon down, my hands tightening instinctively. 1 week. I had known this moment would come, yet it still struck me with the same shock, as if time should have granted us one more reason to stay. An hour later, Michael and I stood inside Evelyn's room. She lay still on her bed pillows, supporting her back, her eyes half closed, her lips dry, her thin hands resting lightly atop the blanket. Sunlight streamed through the window and washed over her in a pale gold, making her look as if she were fading like an old photograph, losing its details to the light. I spoke softly. "Miss Evelyn, would you like to eat something? I can make the chicken and beet soup you once told me about." She opened her eyes and slowly shook her head. "No soup." "But I want to be in the kitchen." Her voice was no longer truly a voice, only a faint echo traveling from a faraway place. Michael sat beside her, looked at his mother, then turned to me. "Can we move her bed downstairs into the kitchen?" His question stunned me into silence. I looked at him, then at Evelyn, and then I nodded. We cleared a large space between the stove and the dining table, pushing back the spice shelf and old wooden chairs. Maria called the hospice team, and they brought down a portable hospital bed with wheels smaller and easier to maneuver. Within 2 hours, everything had been rearranged. Evelyn's bed was placed beside the window where she could see the garden, feel the sunlight pouring in, and most importantly, see me cook each day. When we moved her from her room, she barely had the strength to open her eyes, yet her hand clung to mine the entire way from the hallway to the kitchen, a soft but deliberate grip, like a thank you, that did not need words. From that day on, every meal I cooked became a silent ritual between us. I began by preparing the ingredients, always telling her each step, even when her eyes were closed, describing the scents rising in the air, asking if she wanted more of this or less of that. Sometimes she nodded faintly. Sometimes she simply smiled. Once I mentioned the fried zapole she used to make for her grandchildren on the feast days, and though her eyes remained closed, a single tear slipped down her cheek. I did not ask why. Instead, I quietly took out the flour, heated the oil, and made a small batch dusted with powdered sugar. When I placed the first pastry on the old white porcelain plate with the thin gold rim, she opened her eyes and looked at it as if a memory had been set gently into her hands. She chewed slowly, her lips trembling, tears running down the soft folds of her face. After that, I began dedicating each afternoon to recreating one dish from her memories. Some days her pasta bolognese from the night she and her husband attended their first opera together. Other days the veal braised with lemon and black pepper she made when her second son left for college. Michael grew quieter as the days passed, but he was present more often, lingering longer beside his mother, sometimes helping me wash dishes or trim vegetables. We did not need to talk much. The kitchen had become the center of all connection, the place where Evelyn lived fully, through her last moments, with everything she still possessed. The fragrances, the sound of a knife tapping the cutting board, the gentle sizzle of oil in a pan, and the stories that rose from each dish I made. I knew she was slipping away little by little, but I also knew that in this small kitchen she was still here. In her faint smile when the scent of melting cheese filled the room, in her fragile breath, as I named each ingredient as if awakening an entire lifetime that had been asleep. And I, merely a passerby in her life, had been chosen to stay, to witness, to cook her final meals, not for death, but for memory. I cannot remember exactly when my body first began to resist each step, each turn, each movement in the kitchen. Maybe it was the night spent awake writing down every recipe Evelyn passed on to me. Maybe it was the effort of swallowing my tears as I watched her fade a little more each day, or maybe it was the loneliness that began seeping into the spaces between my breaths, even though I was surrounded by warm, gentle people. Whatever the reason, by that Saturday morning, I could no longer hold myself upright. I collapsed beside the sink, my hands trembling, my breath shortening, the world blurring into a haze, as if the entire kitchen were spinning. I did not want anyone to see me weak, especially when I was the one bringing warmth to this family each day. But when I opened my eyes, the first person I saw was Michael. He sat down beside me, his hands steady and warm against my back. No questions, no judgment, only a presence strong enough to make me feel I was no longer falling alone. "You do not have to hold everything together all the time," he murmured, almost a whisper. "My mother feels the love in your food, but she is sensitive enough to see that you are slowly wearing down." I shook my head, still too weak to stand. "I am fine, I just need a moment." Michael said nothing, simply poured a glass of warm water and helped me sit up. He took a damp cloth and wiped my forehead the way one might care for a family member, without hesitation, without annoyance. I had never imagined Michael could carry such gentleness. He had always seemed like a man, built from quiet strength, someone who moved through the world with a protective shell and only acted when necessary. But in that moment, he was no longer the strong son holding his family together. He was simply a man who saw another person collapse and chose not to look away. "You have done enough, Emma," he said softly. "Let me help. At least today." For the first time, I allowed someone else to stand in my kitchen. I showed him how to sauté onions without burning them, how to taste for salt on the tip of his tongue instead of a spoon, how to tell when a sauce was ready by dragging a spoon lightly across the bottom of the pan to see the trail it left. Michael was clumsy, but patient, never complaining. At one point, our hands touched as we both reached for the knife, and I felt my heart tighten in a way that was both unfamiliar and strangely familiar, as if I had not let anyone close to me in a very long time. When everything was done, I sat at the table and watched him carry the pasta to his mother's bedside. Evelyn lay there with her eyes closed, the faintest smile lingering on her lips. I saw him lean down and whisper something into her ear. I could not hear the words, but when he turned back toward me, his eyes no longer held the guarded distance of our first days. They were fuller, warmer, touched by something that had begun to shift. That night, after everyone had gone to rest, I sat alone under the kitchen light. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the scent of tomato sauce still warm in the air. Michael walked in, said nothing, and pulled out the chair beside me. After a long moment, he spoke, still staring ahead. "I did not think you would stay this long. When I wrote that email, I hoped someone might help my mother eat a few more meals. But now—" He paused, drew a breath, then looked directly at me. "I think you have done much more than that." I smiled faintly, my heart tightening like a single string plucked in the quiet. Some things do not need naming for us to know they are already growing. And in this kitchen where death was drawing near, something else was taking root as well. Life not the physical kind, but the life of emotion, of connection, of the pieces of ourselves we thought we had lost long ago. The next morning when I stepped into the Romano house, Maria was already waiting at the door, her eyes darkened and her voice noticeably smaller. "Miss Evelyn, she is much weaker today. She said if you come, please go in right away. She wants to talk to you." I did not ask anything more, only nodded, set my bag of ingredients in the corner of the kitchen, and hurried toward her room. Evelyn was no longer lying flat but propped on her side, her head resting on a high pillow and her hands folded over her stomach as if holding something precious. Her eyes were half open, her lips dry, but the faint familiar smile still appeared when she saw me enter. "Emma," she called me as though she had known I would come. "Sit here right beside me." I moved closer and held her hand as I always did, but this time I could feel the cold settling into her thin knuckles more clearly than ever. A moment later, Michael walked in and quietly sat on the other side. Evelyn turned her head to look at both of us, her gaze startlingly lucid, as if all the drifting sleeps, the delirious spells, the gasping breaths of the past days had been nothing but shells she had shed. She looked at me first, then her son. "Both of you, listen carefully to your mother's words, because I will not repeat them." Her voice was not loud, but it carried weight, each word, cutting into the silence of the room. Michael nodded, tightening his grip on her hand, while I could only sit still, hollow and waiting. "Emma," she turned to me, "you are the first person in so many years who made me feel like I still belong to this world. Not because you cook well, though you truly do, but because you look at me not as someone dying, but as someone still living." My throat closed, but she lifted a finger, signaling me not to interrupt. "So I have something to ask of you. No, something I need you to promise." She fought for a breath, then continued. "Keep cooking, but not only for those who are near the end. Cook for the ones who are still alive, but have forgotten how to feel. Bring memory back to the table. Make each dinner a moment to remember to love, to forgive." I bowed my head, my tears falling onto her hand. "I promise," I whispered. "I will do that." Evelyn nodded faintly, then turned to Michael. "And you," she said, her voice softening into something like a breeze brushing a cheek. "You are the most stubborn child I ever had. You do not know how to say I love you, but you have carried this family in your heart for so many years. You think you must be strong, must shoulder everything, must protect. But Michael, love is not always a burden. Sometimes it is simply taking someone's hand and saying, 'I know you are tired, I will take care of the rest.'" Michael lowered his head, his large hand gripping hers like a child who has just been seen through completely. I had never seen him like that, quiet, breakable, fully open to the breath of the woman who raised him. "I want you to promise," Evelyn said, her eyes locked on him. If you feel something for Emma, do not bury it under ash. Do not wait another 5 years to realize you missed something precious. You do not need to make me proud anymore. You only need to live happy. Michael did not answer at once. His lips pressed together, his eyes red, and then he nodded slowly. I promise, he said, his voice rough and low. I will not run anymore. Evelyn closed her eyes for a few seconds, as if that promise alone was stronger medicine than anything morphine could offer. She smiled again, clearer this time, and looked at both of us, her voice thin as early morning mist. If I have to leave, at least I know something will continue in this kitchen. Michael and I sat beside her for a long while, neither of us speaking, listening only to the sound of the oxygen machine, the ticking of a wall clock, and a silence that was no longer frightening. In the pale light of the late morning, with the faint scent of leftover broth still lingering in the air, I realized this was no longer a family losing someone. This was a family being reborn through what seemed like fragile last words, but were in truth new lines of life flowing from a heart preparing to stop. Evelyn did not ask for forever. She asked only for a promise. And we, with everything we had left, would keep that promise. Evelyn passed away on a quiet morning when the sun had risen just high enough for its light to reach the head of the bed, touching her silver hair and the lines on her face that no longer moved. Maria was the first to find her carrying in the warm cup of water she brought each day. She called Evelyn's name softly, once, then fell silent, rested a hand on her forehead, and bowed her head. There were no cries, no sobs, only a silence so full that it seemed to still the entire house. Michael and I entered not long after. He stopped at the doorway, his eyes fixed on his mother, as though he could not believe what he had known for a long time would eventually come. I placed a hand on his, but he did not react. He simply moved forward, slowly knelt beside the bed, buried his face in her arm, and released a single choked sound so faint that if I had not been standing beside him, I might never have heard it. Michael did not wail, did not break apart aloud, but his body trembled in small, continuous waves, as if something inside him were fracturing quietly. I sat beside him saying nothing, only resting my hand on his back to keep him from shattering entirely. The rest of the day passed like mist. The funeral home staff arrived with their practiced gentleness and calm. I became the one to handle the calls, informing the closest relatives, drafting a brief obituary, choosing a photograph for the funeral program. I do not remember how many hours I slept during the 3 days of preparation, but every decision I made felt guided by the part of Evelyn she had placed in me. I did not choose a grand church. I chose a small chapel beside a lavender garden, where the morning light always streamed through stained glass in soft violet hues that reminded me of her voice. I refused the industrial catering. I cooked myself. With the help of Maria and a few close neighbors, I prepared a small table of dishes after the service. Everything Evelyn loved: stuffed shells, braised veal, Italian salad with fresh oregano, and especially the batch of zeppel she had wept over when she tasted them for the last time. On the morning of the funeral, I saw Michael in a black suit, perfectly neat, but hollow-eyed. He walked slowly, each step weighted, as though he carried an entire world on his shoulders. When the casket was placed in the center of the chapel, he tightened his fist, and no tears fell anymore, as if whatever remained inside him had turned to stone during the past 3 days. The service was brief and simple. The pastor read a few verses, then invited family members to share memories. Michael rose and spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. My mother was a woman who never needed anyone to know how much she sacrificed. Only that dinner was hot, and everyone was in their place. She never said "I love you" with words, but every time I came home the kitchen lights were on. And now, even though she has gone, I can still hear the sound of her knife on the cutting board, the sizzle of her pan. My mother will not disappear. She has only changed form. And I know she will still be here every time I cook something whose scent feels achingly familiar. No one spoke after him. The silence that followed his return to his seat was heavy yet complete, the final punctuation mark to a chapter of life. After the service, guests offered condolences and tasted the food. Some cried when they tried the stuffed shells, others quietly held my hand and whispered, "Thank you for doing everything so gently." I said nothing in return, only nodded and smiled through tears. That night, when the house had emptied and quiet returned, I saw Michael sitting on the front steps holding an old photograph of his mother cooking in their childhood kitchen. I joined him, sitting close, the two of us watching one another in the dark without needing words. We both understood that tomorrow everything would change. But one thing would remain: Evelyn in every recipe, every breath, every pulse of life that rose whenever the kitchen lights turned on again. After the funeral ended, people slowly moved to the garden behind the chapel, where I, along with Maria and a few friends, had prepared a simple gathering table. The morning sunlight fell softly like a thin veil drifting over the rows of lavender, making the air feel just a little less sorrowful. The table was not large, but every dish on it was a fragment of Evelyn's memories. I arranged trays of stuffed shells baked crisp at the edges, releasing the mingled scent of tomatoes and cheese plates of fragrant braised veal, with rosemary bowls of fresh green salad, touched with the gentle tartness of Italian lemon. And at the center of the table, on an old ceramic dish I had found in the Romano kitchen, were the zeppole, dusted with fine powdered sugar, like new snow, just the right size to hold between two fingers. People lined up quietly. Some placed a hand on my shoulder. Others looked at me for a long moment, without speaking, before walking away. I understood that gratitude does not always come easily, especially when the thing they were grateful for was born from loss. Michael stood at a distance, greeting each relative, nodding and embracing them, no longer as rigid as he had been in the days before. I saw that he could finally breathe a little deeper, though his eyes still carried traces of exhaustion. When most people had settled into their seats, scattered across the garden, Maria walked out of the chapel holding a cream-colored envelope sealed with red wax that had slightly smudged. She handed it to Michael. "This letter was left by Miss Evelyn. She asked me to give it on the morning after the funeral, when everyone has eaten a little and can sit to listen." Michael looked at the envelope for a long moment, then turned to me. "Could you read it for me?" His voice was hoarse, not from grief alone, but as if something was lodged in his throat, holding him still. I took the letter and carefully opened it. The paper inside was thin ivory toned, carrying the scent of an old bookshelf mixed with dried flowers. I stood beside a small table, looked around once, and began reading each word, shaped as though Evelyn herself were speaking through me. "If you are reading these lines, it means I am no longer here, at least not in the way the world calls being present. But I hope today will not be a day only for tears. I hope it will also be a day to remember that I once lived with all the sweetness, the salt, and even the bitterness that life offered." I paused, taking a breath as my voice began to tremble. Every eye was on me, yet I no longer felt nervous, only felt an unnamed swell rising in my chest. "Michael, you are the child who worried me most, but also the one I trusted most. I know you always believed you had to be strong, had to be the pillar. But never forget, you are also someone who deserves to be weak, to be loved, to need someone beside you. Do not spend the rest of your life trying only to make me proud. Live so that you feel peace in your own heart." I glanced at Michael and saw him bow his head, his hands clasped tightly on his lap, but his expression softer, gentler than before. I continued reading. "Emma. I never imagined I would one day write a letter to a stranger who came to cook in my home. But now I see you as my own daughter. Thank you for bringing the kitchen back to life, for shaping my memories into something real through each dish, each scent, and every smile you brought into this house. If you are still here when I am gone, I hope you will continue to cook as you always have, with your whole heart." My voice faltered, and I inhaled deeply before reading on. "And if you, Michael and Emma, should find something in each other, do not be afraid. Do not hesitate because of me. I leave behind no great inheritance, Only a few old tin boxes, a handful of recipes, and a house with more empty corners than full ones. But I leave you my blessing that love can begin in a kitchen and grow from the simplest of things. I folded the letter, my hands still trembling. No one spoke for several minutes. Only the wind moved through the trees. A spoon clinked against a plate and scattered sniffles broke the quiet. Michael stepped toward me, took the letter from my hands, holding it as though it were sacred. Then he lifted his head, his eyes wet but bright, and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. My mother never needed a monument. She only needed us to keep living according to what she believed was good. And I think today we can begin doing just that. Everyone nodded together. The gathering continued, no longer as hushed as before. There were voices, stories being retold, hands reaching out to touch another in gratitude. In that garden filled with sunlight, I understood something with certainty. Evelyn was still here in every word she left behind, in every flavor she loved, and in the way people sat together again, after a loss that could not be named. On the first Sunday evening after the funeral, the Romano kitchen glowed with light again, not the cold light of waiting, nor the heavy silence of grief, but a warm brightness that felt like something beginning to return. I arrived early, carrying my familiar bag of ingredients, my apron, my notebook, and a thread of nervousness I tried to hide beneath calm composure. Michael opened the door, dressed in a simple white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up as always, and instead of the familiar exhaustion on his face, he offered a faint smile when he saw me. "They will be here in about an hour," he said, stepping aside for me to enter. "It will probably be awkward, but maybe that is the best way to begin again." I nodded, my heart quieting. My promise to Evelyn still lived in me, and tonight was the first step toward honoring it. Michael had called his 3 cousins, 2 aunts from Brooklyn, and several relatives and family friends of the Romano household. Those who had been absent from Sunday dinners because of history, misunderstanding, or distance now received a simple invitation. Sunday dinner, Mother would want this. The kitchen grew livelier than it had been in days. I chose lasagna as the centerpiece of the meal because it was something built in layers, each layer carrying a memory, a feeling. There was also minestrone soup, crisp, garlic butter, bread salad with cherry tomatoes, and fresh mozzarella, and a tray of tiramisu I had spent the afternoon chilling to perfection. When the doorbell rang, Michael hurried off to greet the guests, while I wiped my hands on my apron, my heartbeat quickening a little. The first to arrive were his 2 aunts. One was in her early 60s with neatly curled platinum hair and sharp, observant eyes. The other was smaller, brown-haired with a gentle face and timid gaze. They looked around the house as though stepping back into a museum where memories had been tucked away too carefully. "You must be Emma," the older aunt said after Michael introduced us. "You cooked for Evelyn." I nodded and smiled. I had the honor of preparing her last meals, and if you do not mind tonight, I would be honored to cook for all of you as well. The 2 women exchanged glances, then offered small nods. The other guests arrived soon after, some I recognized faintly from the funeral, others I had never seen. They all shared the same hesitant voices, low steps, cautious, as if they were walking into a space they had abandoned for too long and no longer knew how to touch. I guided everyone to the long table draped with a white cloth set with plates, silverware, and glasses of red wine. At first the air felt stiff. Polite questions, awkward nods, the faint clinking of utensils on porcelain sounding louder than it should. But then the lasagna was served, and as the scent of melted cheese and simmered meat sauce drifted across the table, something began to soften. The gentle aunt recalled the last time Evelyn made this dish for her 60th birthday. A cousin laughed while telling the story of being scolded for breaking a vase only to be secretly given 2 extra pastries afterward. One story led to another, and laughter threaded itself between the seats, shoulders leaned a little closer, and the glow in everyone's eyes began to return. Michael sat beside me occasionally, serving food to others, And every so often he turned toward me with a smile filled with quiet gratitude. He did not need to speak, his eyes carried everything. When the tiramisu was brought out, someone laughed upon noticing that I had layered the cake exactly the way Evelyn used to, and even the strictest of the two aunts whispered to me as she helped gather dishes. You make things just like Evelyn. Not only the food, but the way you look at people as if they truly matter. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood at the sink washing dishes, my heart strangely light. Michael entered the kitchen leaning against the doorway, his eyes no longer hollowed by grief. "You did more than cook tonight, Emma," he said. "You brought a family back together." I smiled and said nothing, because I knew I had simply done what Evelyn wanted. A Sunday evening, a tender meal, and a promise being quietly fulfilled through love. After that first Sunday dinner, the Romano house was no longer the same. The evenings that followed arrived more gently, more warmly, and people soon began calling them Evelyn's dinners as a way of keeping her threaded into everyday life. I still came every week carrying my apron, my notebook, and sometimes a small flower to place on the table the way Evelyn once did. But slowly coming only on Sundays was no longer enough. It was not just about cooking anymore. It was about being present. One Wednesday afternoon, after I had helped Michael sort through some of Evelyn's old recipe books, a sudden heavy rain came down. Michael sat on the doorstep with a cup of coffee, and I stood beside him, my hair slightly damp, my coat still carrying the scent of oregano from the lunchtime soup. He looked at me with an expression that seemed to be listening for something unspoken. Then he asked quietly, not loudly, but with a certainty that made my heart pause, "Do you ever think you would not need to go home every night?" I looked up and saw in his eyes not a rushed invitation, but something steady, deep, and impossibly gentle. I did not answer right away. But the following week, I brought a few extra clothes, some of my favorite books, and a small ceramic bedside lamp that had belonged to my mother. There was no formal move-in day, no boxes or suitcases, just small things slowly appearing in a house that already felt like home. Maria saw me placing my belongings in the closet and simply smiled without asking a single question. Michael began asking my opinion whenever he rearranged something in the house, the painting in the living room moving the basil pot closer to the window for more sun. We cooked not only on Sundays, but on Tuesdays or Fridays too, on nights when we both needed a reason to slow down. There were mornings when I woke earlier than he did, brewed coffee, and left a small note beside it. "Fresh bread in the kitchen. Do not skip breakfast." And there were nights when he waited up for me after a class I taught at the community center, the kitchen light glowing, and a warm bowl of pasta waiting with a note written in his sharp, straight letters, "Even chefs need to be fed." We did not say love quickly. We had both lost too much to rush. We knew feelings needed to be tended with steady presence, not dazzling promises. But one night when I made lemon chicken that Michael said tasted exactly like the dish his wife once cooked, he looked at me for a very long moment, and then gently placed his hand over mine. I think he said softly that if Evelyn were still alive, she would not be surprised to see us like this. I intertwined my fingers with his, fitting into the spaces between them, as though they had always been meant to rest there. We did not need to name whatever this was. Both of us understood that this was family, a family patched together from loss, stitched with tenderness and strengthened by trust. Once as I stood in the kitchen, looking at the basil plant outside the window, with sunlight streaming through the old silk curtain Evelyn had hung, a strange feeling rose inside me, a feeling not of the overwhelming rush of first love, but the quiet certainty of having found where I belonged. I was no longer the visitor who came to cook final meals, but the one keeping the fire lit so the kitchen would continue to glow. And Michael was no longer the grieving man closed off by sorrow, but the partner who was opening his heart, little by little making space for both of us to step into a new chapter, where affection was no longer hidden in glances, but lived in every gesture, every shared silence, and every meal eaten together beneath the familiar warm light of the kitchen. The idea came to us not in a burst of brilliance or in the midst of applause the way films like to imagine it. But on a softly rainy evening, while I was frying zeppole, and Michael was turning the pages of his mother's recipe notebook, the pages yellowed with time marked with small stains of oil, but still carrying every careful note written in blue ink. He reached a page marked with a pressed dried flower and stayed silent for a long moment before looking up and asking, his voice gentle, as though he feared shattering something fragile in the air, whether I had ever thought that these dishes should not remain only in the kitchen of our home. I tilted my head at him and saw in his eyes not simply a question, but the shape of a dream beginning to form. He continued, not for profit, not because he wanted to build something grand, but because his mother deserved to be known by more people through the food she had loved. And because he believed that if anyone could carry that forward, it would be me. I went still for a few seconds, moved and trembling at the same time. I was a cook accustomed to small kitchens, to preparing meals for those whose lives were nearing their end, not for crowds waiting each night. But when I saw the light in Michael's eyes, I understood this was not just a project. It was a continuation. It was Evelyn's promise carried out beyond the old kitchen in the quiet house, becoming a place for anyone who believed that memories could be awakened by scent. We talked through every step. The first was finding a space. Michael wanted somewhere near Montclair to keep the spirit of this place alive but warm and intimate enough that anyone walking inside might feel they were stepping into a home. We chose a two-story historic house that had stood empty in the center of town. The lower floor was wide enough for about 15 tables with an open kitchen facing the dining area, while the upper floor would be the office and a space to store recipes, old photographs of Evelyn, and a few objects she had cherished. Next came the name. We wrote down many possibilities, but both of us stopped when I wrote two words on a sheet of paper: Evelyn's. Nothing else. Not Evelyn's kitchen or Evelyn's table. Only that name, and it was enough. Evelyn's would not simply be an Italian restaurant. It would be a place where every dish carried a story. The lasagna she made on the first rainy day after her husband died. The zeppole she prepared only on Easter. The lemon chicken she cooked to comfort Michael after his first job rejection. We decided that every table would have a small, handwritten piece reproduced from Evelyn's recipe book, like a memory tucked beside each dish. Guests would not come simply to eat, but to touch something real, something achingly human. Renovation took time, but with every tile replaced, every chair chosen, every antique brass ceiling lamp, Michael polished by hand, I felt as though we were assembling something sacred. Sometimes we argued over whether the lights should be warm or cool, whether the tablecloths should be lace or simple linen. But those disagreements always softened again over a plate of spaghetti shared late at night, or in the quiet way he held my hand while we walked through the busy street together, both imagining the line of people who might one day stand outside Evelyn's. One night, sitting alone in the almost finished kitchen with a spoon of the very first batch of tomato sauce cooked there, tears slipped down my face unexpectedly. Not from exhaustion, but because I could feel Evelyn in every soft clatter of the pot, in the glow of the metal counter, in the anticipation that something beautiful was about to begin. And when Michael came in and wrapped his arms around me from behind, I knew he felt it too. Evelyn's was not only her dream anymore. It had become ours, a dream simmered in love, served with memory, and sustained by our belief that sometimes loss is not an ending, but the beginning of something even warmer. Turning Evelyn's from an idea into a real restaurant proved to be a journey longer than any recipe I had ever cooked, and at times it burned as fiercely as a forgotten cake left in the oven. In those early days of renovation, Michael and I were full of fire, driven by the belief that love and memory would guide us. But within a few weeks, we began to collide with the hardest parts of building not just a place that served food, but a space carrying the soul of someone who was gone. Every decision that looked simple on the surface pulled a long thread of emotion behind it. We argued about the floor tiles. I wanted the darker, older tiles I had seen in the Italian kitchens from Evelyn's family photo albums, while Michael preferred bright modern ones, easier to clean and more current. I raised my voice a little that day, and he grew so quiet the air itself felt tight. Another time I suggested replacing the old refrigerator Evelyn had used with a newer, more efficient model. Michael said nothing, simply shut his notebook hard and walked outside to smoke. He did not come home that night. I stood in the half-finished kitchen staring at boxes of supplies still unpacked, the warm light casting shadows on the raw brick walls, and felt a sorrow I did not know how to name. I wondered if I had gone too far, if I was doing something Evelyn would never have wanted. But the next morning, when I arrived early to clean up alone, I found Michael already there, sitting on the front steps, with a cup of cold coffee beside him, and eyes that looked like he had not slept at all. He did not apologize, and I did not need him to. We sat beside each other for a long while before he finally murmured that he was not angry with me, only afraid that changing too much would mean his mother would be forgotten. I placed my hand over his and whispered that if his mother were alive, she would have been the first to tell him not to cling to an old refrigerator out of fear that a memory might disappear. Evelyn had always wanted things to grow, not stay trapped. After that, we learned how to work together differently. I wrote down the reason behind every change, labeled each shelf according to the order Evelyn once used. Michael learned when to step back and give me space in the kitchen, and I learned which old details deserved to stay, not because they were useful, but because they were loved. Some afternoons we stopped everything to taste a new soup and talk about whether it needed another herb. Some late nights we argued over paint colors, then settled into soft jazz and sat against the wall drinking wine like two wanderers who had stumbled on one another in the middle of dust and broken bricks. Maria came to help on a few days, bringing Evelyn's old curtains, photographs that had never been hung, and a tin box of handwritten recipes she had once hidden in the cupboard to protect them from humidity. We decided to dedicate a small corner of the restaurant to a memory nook where those photos would hang beside a journal for guests to write down memories of meals or loved ones they missed. We hired local workers, partly to save money and partly because we wanted Evelyn's to belong to the community. They understood that this was not an ordinary eatery, and they laid each brick and framed each doorway with the care of people contributing to something larger than their craft. The day the new refrigerator arrived was the same day Evelyn's original wooden shelf, newly polished, was installed in the center of the kitchen where the light struck most beautifully. Michael stood looking at it for a long moment before turning toward me with softened eyes, as though he had finally put down a burden he had carried too many years. There were tense days and disagreements, but what kept us there was the very thing Evelyn had left behind: do not just cook, breathe life into the food. And we were doing exactly that, step by imperfect step, but with all our hearts. The restaurant was not yet open, but in our minds it was already a home, not because of the brick or wood, but because of what was being built from love, even with all the small cracks along the way. Opening day at Evelyn's arrived on an early spring afternoon when the air still carried a trace of winter's chill, but the sunlight was warm enough to coax the first blossoms on the peach tree by the entrance into opening. I woke very early, not from nerves, but because my heart was beating in a strange, hurried rhythm, as though it knew this was the turning of a new chapter. Michael had reached the kitchen before me. He had brewed coffee and left a cup on the counter with a small handwritten note saying, "Today is the day she will smile. I am certain." The kitchen was fragrant with slow simmered tomato sauce, fresh basil and ricotta, just mixed to a perfect softness. We did not speak much that morning, exchanging only quiet glances that said everything. What we had built over so many months was finally ready for the world. Everything in the restaurant was prepared as if Evelyn might walk through the door at any moment. The white tablecloths were pressed smooth without a single crease. The small cards printed with lines taken from her recipe book were set carefully beside each place setting. The memory corner where we had hung her photographs now had a bundle of dried lavender and a winter scarf Michael said she never went without. Guests began arriving a little before opening time. The first was Maria, in a pale blue coat, carrying a small bouquet. She embraced me tightly, her eyes rimmed with red. Then came the two aunts who had been at the first Sunday dinner, and slowly a line began forming along the sidewalk. Some were familiar to me, some I knew only through stories told in Evelyn's kitchen, and some were complete strangers who had come simply because they had heard this was a place where food was cooked with the heart. When the main door opened and the warm kitchen lights rose for the first time, a round of applause echoed through the room. Michael stood beside me, his hand closing around mine with a gentle squeeze. He looked around and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "She is here, isn't she?" I nodded, my throat tight. Evelyn was present in every detail in the lasagna, with its slightly crisped edges just as she liked in the antique chandelier above table number 4 that she once said had the best light for telling the stories of a life in the bright laughter of the guests, sharing the zeppeli I had timed to the second. There was a moment when I brought a plate of stuffed shells to an elderly couple, and the wife looked at me for a long time before saying, "This smell. It is exactly like the first dinner after I had my first child." I do not know why, but the moment I breathed it in, I wanted to cry. And I did cry, because I understood then that Evelyn was no longer only living in the memories of Michael and me. She had begun to live in the memories of others. At the end of the night, when the crowd had thinned and the noise had softened into something like a gentle background melody, Michael drew me toward the memory corner. He opened a drawer in the old cabinet and took out a letter. I recognized Evelyn's handwriting immediately. He handed it to me and said only 3 words. "She left this." My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Inside, Evelyn had written, "If you are reading this, it means that perhaps, in some way, you have decided to share the warmth of our table with the world. I always secretly dared to wish that one day this kitchen would become a home for more people than just our family. Thank you for not forgetting me. Thank you for loving Emma. Let her cook as who she truly is. I know that somehow you will understand that the taste of love is not in the recipe. It is in trust." I could not speak. Michael wrapped his arms around me from behind, and we stood there in silence, surrounded by light and scent by memory and the present moment. Evelyn's had become far more than a place to eat. It was a space where someone might remember they had once been loved, once been cooked for with a whole heart. And in that room overflowing with warmth, I believed that Evelyn had returned not as a shadow, but as a flavor that would never fade. Sunday dinner arrived later than usual that week because Evelyn's had just finished celebrating its 1-month anniversary, and we were both exhausted after so many long nights of non-stop service. Yet in the midst of that fatigue, something made my heart beat faster and my hands tremble like a girl stepping into the kitchen for the very first time. That evening I chose to wear the pale floral dress Evelyn had always loved, the fabric soft and light like an embrace from the past. Michael noticed nothing unusual until he saw me chopping parsley more slowly than usual and resting my hand on my belly in an unconscious gesture. He looked at me, his brow furrowing slightly, and then he froze in the middle of the kitchen, his eyes searching my face as though trying to confirm something beyond what I had spoken. I smiled and gave a small nod. He blinked several times, his eyes shining with tears he refused to let fall. Without a word, he stepped forward and wrapped me in an embrace so tight and overwhelmed it made my breath catch. We said nothing more until the guests began to arrive. That Sunday dinner was fuller than ever, with Maria, a few of Evelyn's old neighbors, and several of our closest staff from the restaurant. I had prepared a new dish inspired by the stuffed shells from the very beginning, but this time replacing the ricotta with a mixture of goat cheese and young spinach, creating something gentler and lighter, a softer echo of an old memory. The table soon filled with laughter and voices, yet I found myself watching each face, seeing the light return to eyes that had once been dimmed by grief, now slowly brightening with new rhythms of life. When dessert was served, an apple cake topped with smooth vanilla cream, the one Evelyn used to say could heal the grayest of days, I stood up with a glass of water in my hand and felt every gaze turn toward me. I had no grand speech prepared. I simply took a slow breath and said that there was something Michael and I wished to share, because if Evelyn were still alive, she would have been the very first to notice it with only one glance. I placed my hand on my belly, keeping my eyes on the people gathered around the table, and continued. This family has given me more than I ever imagined. A home, someone to love, a memory to protect. And now we are preparing to welcome a new gift, a new life, a small soul who will carry the name of the woman who taught me that food is love. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, as if everyone inhaled at the exact same moment, then erupted into laughter and applause and tears. Maria reached me first, pulling me into her arms, her eyes red but shining, whispering that Evelyn must be smiling somewhere, and that this child would grow up with meals carrying love from 3 generations. Michael stood behind me with his hand resting on my shoulder, his eyes glowing like candlelight on a peaceful evening. He did not need to say a word. He simply bent to kiss my hair, and the entire world seemed to fold into that warm moment. After dinner, when everyone had left, I remained alone in the kitchen, where the overhead light spilled across the counter, where I had once sliced the very first tomatoes in this home. I placed my hand on my belly, not only to feel the life growing inside me, but as a way of sending Evelyn a new promise. You will hear stories about her, about this kitchen, about the restaurant that bears her name, and about the meals that brought together people who once thought they had nothing left to believe in. And one day you will cook your first stuffed shells in this very kitchen where love has always begun with the scent of garlic and olive oil, and ended with a gentle smile like the last light of the day. That morning the sky over Montclair was covered in a thin veil of clouds, and the light coming through the kitchen window fell like a soft ribbon of pale gold, gentle as the touch of a hand. I was sitting at the table flipping through my notes as I prepared the menu for the upcoming week at Evelyn's, when Michael walked in holding a cream-colored envelope tied with a faded blue ribbon. He sat beside me, his expression a mix of confusion and emotion, then placed the envelope on the table and said quietly that he had found it in the old drawer his mother used for the things she considered important, and that it had my name on it. I touched the envelope with the tip of my finger, feeling as though I were brushing against a memory long asleep. My voice trembled as I asked whether his mother had written it for me. He nodded without speaking, simply giving my hand a gentle squeeze. I loosened the ribbon, opened the envelope, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It was her familiar slanted handwriting, the ink a soft purple, as though time itself had been careful not to disturb the words. Dear Emma, if you are reading this, it means you have chosen to stay. To stay with Michael, to stay with the kitchen, with the memories, and with the truest version of yourself. First, thank you. Thank you for coming into the final days of my life, not just with an apron and a knife, but with a gentle heart patient enough to hear the things no one else had the strength to listen to. You reminded me that love still exists, even when everything seems to be ending. Michael is a man carrying more wounds than he ever shows. I know that has left you tired and lost at times, but if you are carrying a new life within you, as I hope, then you are giving him a chance to love from the beginning. That child is not only your future, but his chance to heal, the chance for this family to gain another pair of arms, another voice, another scent of milk and cookies, filling old empty spaces. I once thought I would not live to see that day, but in truth, I have always believed you were the one who would help it come to pass. Because you love with patience, with understanding, not just with promises. And that is the only thing that can hold a family together. When you teach your child to make stuffed shells for the first time, remember to tell them that their great-grandmother once used her most exhausted hands to fill each shell every Sunday because she believed love begins with care. When you tell them about me, you do not need to say who I was. Just let them taste tomato sauce simmered for 3 hours and ask them how it feels. If they smile, you will know I am still there. And finally, do not forget to cook for yourself, Emma. You cannot nourish anyone if you forget to nourish your own body and spirit. Do not be afraid to rest. Do not hesitate to let others help you. Michael needs you. Your child will need you, but more than anything, you need yourself. Loving you as though I have known you for a very long time, Evelyn. When I finished reading, tears fell onto the table like drops of salt touching memory. Michael brushed my cheek with his hand, his eyes red, but unflinching. He asked if I could read it again, and I nodded, reading the letter a second time slower this time, as if inviting Evelyn to speak through every syllable. The letter was not merely congratulations or instructions. It was a bridge between past and present, the hand of a mother who had passed resting on my shoulder, reminding me that I would not walk alone through the journey of becoming a mother, a partner, and a keeper of memories shaped by flavor and warmth. I placed the letter inside a small glass frame and set it in the bedside drawer next to the recipe notebook I had begun rewriting from memory. Evelyn was gone, yet somehow she continued to write our story through purple ink, through lingering scents, and through a love that no ending could bury. 5 years later, the kitchen at Evelyn's still glowed every Sunday morning, like a ritual no one needed to remember because it was simply lived. Sunlight filtered through the white curtain by the window and fell across the marble countertop where I was laying out the cooked pasta shells on a tray. Beside me was a tiny hand, trembling slightly as it held a spoon, clumsily scooping the ricotta and spinach mixture and trying its best to fill each pasta shell with careful concentration. "Is this right, Mommy?" my daughter whispered, as though afraid to disturb the air itself. I looked down at her, smiled, nodded, and said, "Perfect, Lucy. Your great-grandmother would definitely approve." Lucy was 5 years old with dark brown curls like Michael's and eyes the soft green of early autumn. She had grown up in the scent of this kitchen since she could crawl, and now with her little floral apron tied crookedly around her waist, she was the smallest living version of the memories I once shared with Evelyn. Michael often said Lucy had his mother's way of looking at the world, deep and slow, as if she were listening for something other people missed. She not only helped me cook, but constantly asked about the old stories, especially about the woman she had never met, but somehow called great-grandmother with a strange, natural familiarity. "Mommy, did she smile a lot?" Lucy asked, as she placed another pasta shell onto the tray. I nodded, paused, and brushed a streak of flour from her cheek. She did, but only when someone cooked with their whole heart. She didn't like food made without care. Lucy pondered this, then murmured as if committing something sacred to memory. "Then I have to learn to cook really well, so she can be happy." I did not answer, only pulled her gently into my arms, feeling a wave of gratitude and emotion wash over me, the kind of feeling that made me imagine Evelyn sitting somewhere in the kitchen watching and smiling. After finishing the tray of pasta, Lucy and I prepared the sauce together. She already knew the rule: the sauce must simmer for at least 3 hours, with finely chopped shallots, crushed garlic, crushed tomatoes, and fresh thyme picked from the little pot on the balcony. I turned on the stove, set the pot down, then bent so Lucy could hold the wooden spoon and stir in slow circles. The fragrance spread through the kitchen, and I closed my eyes for a moment, letting memory pull me back to that sunlit room years ago, where Evelyn lay in her bed by the window and told me that scent is the strongest form of memory. When Michael walked in, Lucy ran to him, wrapping her arms around his leg and proudly announcing that she was making stuffed shells in the great-grandmother's special version. He lifted her into his arms, kissed her cheek, then looked at me with an expression shaped by all the years we had lived. He came closer, placed his hand on my shoulder, and whispered, "Watching you two is like hearing a song that doesn't need words." I smiled, still stirring the sauce. We're all just playing Evelyn's song again. After dinner that night, once the restaurant had closed and the noise had softened into silence, we sat together at the last table beside Evelyn's photo corner. Lucy had fallen asleep in my arms, her head resting on my shoulder, her hand still clutching a small napkin. Michael pulled from his coat pocket the recipe notebook I had rebound in leather, now worn at the edges and stained with years of oil and memory. He opened to a page marked with a dried lavender flower and handed it to me. "You should add today's recipe here," he said. "Lucy's dish." Her very first. I nodded and wrote in the margin with a purple pen stuffed shells Lucy's first time cooking with her mother. Her great-grandmother surely saw it all. And I knew, truly knew, that Evelyn was here in every smile, in every scent, in every imperfect but love-filled meal. We had not allowed her to fade into a distant memory. She was presence, she was flavor, she was part of the blood and heart of our family, forever. Michael stood by the window of Evelyn's as the late afternoon light shimmered gold against the glass, slowing the whole world into a soft quiet. He looked out onto the street where the last guests had just left after an evening filled with warmth and laughter. In his hand was a cup of cold coffee, and in his heart was something he had no name for, something like gratitude made gentle and deep, as if it had been waiting for years to finally settle. 5 years had passed since his mother's death, since the day a woman named Emma stepped through the black iron gate into a house crowded with memories and opened a door into a life he never thought he could have again. Michael once believed he would never love another time, believed that once the people you cherish disappear, all that remains is duty and survival. But he had been wrong, and that wrongness became the most beautiful gift fate had ever given him. He turned and looked toward the kitchen where Emma was cleaning up with Lucy, their little girl with eyes as bright as Evelyn's smile once was. Watching the two of them giggle as they fought over the last piece of cake, Michael felt, with absolute clarity, that love never disappears. It simply changes shape from a mother to a wife to a child. Love can continue if we are brave enough to keep it alive in the smallest details. He remembered it all: the first dinner with stuffed shells, the sparkle in his mother's eyes when she smelled the slow simmering tomato sauce, the pressure of her hand on his before she slipped away. The letter she wrote to Emma the night Emma cried alone in the kitchen from exhaustion the first time Lucy called him Daddy, with her soft, uneven voice. The first night they saw the restaurant overflowing with guests and understood that memory had found its new home. Evelyn's was not just a restaurant. It was legacy. It was the quiet magic of cooking with one's whole heart. It was proof that grief can become kindness if we refuse to let it harden us. Michael silently thanked destiny, thanked the mother who laid the first stone, thanked the woman who had the courage to step into his life, and thanked himself for not running away. Perhaps the greatest lesson life had given him was that we do not need a perfect beginning, only a reason gentle enough to keep going. And if someone out there is wandering through loss, he hoped they might believe that a warm meal, a quiet hand reaching out, or even a simple promise not to give up could be the place where hope begins again. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the scent from your grandmother's kitchen, or the laughter of someone you miss, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone you love. We create these stories not only to tell them, but to connect us, to remind us that love still exists, still lives in every slice of tomato cut by the trembling hands of memory. Leave us a comment and tell us how you feel, whether the story of Michael, Emma, and Evelyn echoes a part of your own life. We always hope to hear your true emotions from your heart, because that is what makes every story come alive and matter. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. We wish you and your loved ones good health, a peaceful life, and the fullness of each shared moment. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video with more stories filled with inspiration. May each of your days bring a good meal, a warm embrace, and a reason to smile.